Hello everyone. Before we jump in, make sure to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. That way, YouTube knows to keep sharing more stories like this with you. Now, let's get started. I was born in Fairbanks, Alaska, and a lot of my family lived just down the road in North Pole. Growing up there, you get used to the extremes of the place, the long winters where it feels like the cold is trying to eat through your skin, and the summers where the sun barely sets and the world feels endless. It's the kind of place where you see beauty everywhere, but also feel an edge to things, like the land itself is reminding you how small and fragile you are. Some of my earliest memories are of being bundled up so thick I could barely move, walking out to the car with my mom while the snow squeaked under our boots in a sound that only happens when it's well below zero. Summers were mud, mosquitoes, and the smell of birch trees. Everything about that environment stuck deep in me. One night when I was around 7 years old, something happened that I still think about more than 2 decades later. It was one of those spring evenings around breakup, when the snow was melting but the ground wasn't ready to handle it, so everything was soggy and half frozen. Roads turned into slick messes, yards became shallow ponds, and every step could sink you ankle-deep in mud. That time of year always carried a strange feeling, because the dark winters were over, but the long light hadn't quite arrived yet. The air was damp and heavy, with the smell of wet earth and rotting leaves breaking free from under the thaw. My mom, my grandmother, and I had been at my aunt and uncle's place for a family get-together. Their house sat off Badger Road, tucked among the trees like so many places around there. It was the usual kind of family night, everyone talking over each other, food laid out in dishes that steamed up the windows, kids darting between adults' legs. By the time we left, it was late enough that the air outside had cooled into that damp chill, and the mud on the road looked darker under the weak glow of the streetlights. We didn't make it far. Just around the corner from their place, the car sank into a patch of mud that swallowed the tires halfway. I still remember the jolt of the car stopping hard, then the sound of the engine revving uselessly when my mom tried to push it free. Mud flew up against the fenders, but the car just dug itself deeper. We weren't going anywhere. She called my uncle to come pull us out, and all we could do was wait. I sat in the back, staring out the window at the road. The night felt heavy, not silent exactly but muffled, like the soggy ground was soaking up sound. The trees on either side of the road were black against the sky, their bare branches still holding the weight of snow in spots. There weren't many cars out that late, and the ones that did pass kicked up water and mud that glistened in the headlights before it splashed back down. It must have been 15 or 20 minutes that we sat there, headlights off, just waiting in the dim glow of the dome light. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just movement in the corner of my vision, over to the right side of the road where the trees and bushes pushed close to the ditch. Something pale stepped out of the brush. My stomach clenched tight the moment I saw it, because it didn't look right. It wasn't the way a person walks, quick and purposeful, and it wasn't the way an animal moves either. This thing drifted. That's the only word I can think of for it. It looked like a person, or the shape of one, but brighter than anything else around it. Not glowing like a flashlight, but pale, almost the way birch bark looks when headlights hit it in the dark. Its form was loose, without sharp edges, almost like it had fabric draped over it, but not flapping or shifting the way fabric should. The closest comparison I had as a kid was someone with a sheet over their head, but even then I knew that wasn't right. This wasn't a costume or a prank. This thing wasn't trying to look like anything, it just was. It moved across the road in the slowest way I've ever seen something move. I'm talking minutes, not seconds. Its steps, or whatever you'd call them, were stretched out, gliding without lifting or dropping. It didn't pause, didn't look around, didn't hurry. Just a steady drift from one side of the road to the other. My eyes didn't want to leave it. The air in the car felt tighter, like we were all holding our breath. The road was maybe 2 lanes wide, and it took what felt like forever for that figure to cross. The whole time, it kept that strange, steady pace, moving as if time didn't apply to it the way it applied to us. By the time it reached the left side of the road, my hands were clammy against the window glass. It didn't stop. It slipped back into the line of trees and brush, and then it was gone. There was no sound, no footprints, no change in the air when it disappeared. Just the dark road again, empty and wet, as if nothing had ever been there. I remember staring into the trees, waiting for something else to happen, for a sound or another movement, but there was nothing. My uncle showed up soon after with his truck and pulled us out. He didn't see anything on the road, and by the time we were back on solid ground, that part of the night was behind us. But I've never been able to put it behind me. Over the years, I've tried to make sense of it. I've replayed it in my head so many times, thinking about what it could have been. At first, I wondered if it was an animal, maybe a moose moving slow through the brush, but moose don't move like that. They don't glow pale against the dark, and they don't glide. Then I thought maybe it was a person, someone wandering the roads late at night, but no person moves that way either. People stumble, pause, turn their heads, show weight in their steps. This thing had none of that. As I've gotten older, I've leaned toward thinking it might have been something natural, even if I don't know what. Breakup season brings fog sometimes, thin sheets of it that can hang low over the ground. Maybe it was mist catching the light in just the right way, bending across the road in slow layers. Or maybe there was some kind of optical illusion, a trick of headlights from another car bouncing through the trees. I've thought about reflections from ice or water, something that could give the impression of movement where there wasn't any. But none of those explanations ever quite fit what I saw. None of them explain the shape, or the way my stomach turned to ice the moment it appeared, or the way time seemed to stretch while it crossed. It felt too real, too specific, to have just been light or fog. To this day, my mom and grandmother remember it the same way I do. We've talked about it on and off, usually when breakup rolls around again and the roads get muddy. We always circle back to the same point. We don't know what it was. It wasn't a ghost or some storybook thing. It was something out there on that road that didn't make sense. And maybe that's the part that stuck with me all these years. Not that it was frightening, though it was, but that it reminded me how little we really control out there. Alaska has a way of humbling you, of showing you that for all your plans and explanations, the land is older, bigger, and stranger than you can pin down. That night, stuck in the mud just around the corner from my aunt and uncle's house, I learned that sometimes you see things that don't fit neatly into what you know. You can spend your whole life trying to explain them, but in the end, you're left with the memory itself, something pale crossing a dark road, slow as a dream, and gone without a trace. That's all it was. That's all it will ever be. "15 years ago doesn't feel like a long time when you live in a place like rural Alaska. Out here, winters are endless, the cold sits deep in your bones, and the memories of who you've lost stay sharp, like the wind that cuts across the tundra. I still think about my wife's cousin, and every detail of how it happened, because the truth is, what took him could take any one of us. People who live where there are no roads, but snow roads understand. It's not a story you tell to entertain, it's a story you carry, because it's part of what this land does to people, again and again." He had set out on his snow machine from one village to another. That's the way you move in the winter, no highways linking communities, just frozen rivers and trails packed down by years of travel. He knew the route like everybody did, because there aren't many ways to go. The river is both road and risk. On the surface it looks solid, wide and white, stretching for miles, but under that ice the water never stops moving. Current chews away beneath, weakening spots no one can see. It's just the way it is. And he never made it. The first anyone knew something was wrong was when he didn't show up at the other village. At first, people thought maybe he'd turned back, maybe his machine had broken down, maybe he'd holed up somewhere to wait it out. But the longer the hours passed, the more a heaviness grew. In places like this, delays don't usually end well. A man out on his own in the cold has no margin for error. When the search began, they followed his track until it disappeared on the river. That's where they found the disturbed ice. The snow machine had gone in. The water beneath the ice had swallowed him whole, quick and without mercy. Out here, people don't drown in the way you picture in warm lakes or calm waters. They vanish. The ice closes back up around them, and the current pulls them under and away, sometimes hundreds of yards downstream before anything surfaces again. For weeks, they worked to find him. They had to put fishing nets under the ice, downstream from where he went in. Every day, men went out in the bitter cold, cutting holes, lowering nets, waiting. I remember going out there, standing in that vast silence broken only by the groan of shifting ice and the buzzing of snow machines in the distance. The cold was like needles in your face, even under your hood. Breath froze in the air, hanging around like a cloud. And underneath us, the river kept moving unstoppable, carrying what it had taken. When they pulled him out, it wasn't relief. It was finality. The body is not the person anymore, just proof of what happened. His mother collapsed when she saw him. And his daughter, she was too young to understand in that moment, but old enough that the hole it left would never be filled. Out here, grief is a familiar companion. But some losses break people. For his mother, it was a wound that never healed. She'd already lost another son the same way, 10 years before. Same river, same story. 2 children gone to the ice. How does anyone survive that? She never did, not really. She kept on breathing, but she wasn't the same woman. You could see it in her eyes. Something had gone cold in them, colder than the land around her. The truth is, this isn't unusual here. Everyone knows someone who has gone through the ice. So many have died this way that when you hear of another, you don't react with disbelief. You just shake your head, feel that weight in your chest, and think, again. The land doesn't forgive mistakes, and it doesn't care how many years you've lived here or how well you think you know it. It takes who it takes. That's just the truth. People from outside don't understand. They imagine Alaska as wild beauty, mountains and northern lights, something you visit on a cruise ship or see in a postcard. But living here is different. The beauty is real, but it's sharp-edged. It cuts. Nome is a good example of what life here really is: messy, harsh, unforgiving. People still talk about Sonia Ivanov, what happened to her. If you read about Nome, about the cases, the things that went on there, you'll see it's not the Alaska they put on brochures. She was young, full of life, and she was taken murdered. The way it was handled, the way people in power let things slide, it shook the whole community. But she isn't the only one. Her name is just one of many. The state is full of stories like hers, tragedies scattered across villages and towns, each one leaving another family shattered. You begin to realize that here, danger doesn't just come from the ice and cold. It comes from people too, from the silence, from the way things get ignored. After my wife's cousin died, I found myself watching the rivers differently. Before, I would ride over the ice without thinking too much, trusting what looked solid. Now every ripple in the snow, every dark patch, every crack stood out to me. I couldn't help imagining the current underneath, rushing and twisting, waiting. I slowed down. I stuck to trails I knew had been checked. But even then, there's no guarantee. Every winter brings new risks. Every thaw changes the river. Sometimes you cross and it holds. Sometimes it doesn't. That's the gamble every trip carries, and you don't always get to choose. What makes it scarier is how normal it feels to the people who live here. Kids grow up knowing the stories, seeing the search parties, hearing the names of those who don't come back. It's not an abstract danger, it's part of life. You put on your gear, start your machine, and go. You pray you make it across. Most times you do. Sometimes you don't. And the land never gives back what it takes easily. I remember one night sitting in my own home after his funeral. The house was warm, the fire crackling, but I couldn't shake the cold from inside me. I thought about his mother, 2 sons gone. I thought about his little girl, growing up without her father. I thought about how quickly it all happened. One moment riding across the river, the next pulled under. No second chances. And I thought about the dozens of others before him, the ones still missing, the ones never found. Some bodies never surface. Families live with nothing but the memory of where they went in. Can you imagine that? No grave, no closure, just a spot on the river where you stand and know. He's down there somewhere, and I'll never see him again. That's the reality of Alaska that nobody talks about in travel magazines. Out here, life is fragile. One wrong move, one thin patch of ice, and you're gone. And it doesn't just take the person, it takes pieces of everyone who loved them. His mother carried that weight until the day she died. His daughter carries it still. We all do in some way. The older I get, the more I realize this state is full of ghosts, not the kind you see, but the kind you feel in the silence of the tundra, in the emptiness of long trails, in the names carved into wooden crosses standing crooked in frozen ground. Every family has their stories, their losses, their warnings. And still we ride the rivers, because there's no other way to live here. The land demands it, and the land takes its price. Even now, when I hear the hum of a snow machine in the distance, I think about him. I see the place where the ice broke, the nets under the water, the faces of men pulling his body out of the current. I see his mother's hollow eyes, and I feel that cold wind again, the one that never really leaves. And I know this isn't the last time. Someone else will go in. Someone else will be mourned. Because that's Alaska. That's what this place does. And the worst part is, we all know it. I was working in Alaska, out on the Donnelly Dome training grounds, mapping stretches of the Delta River. It was the kind of job that sounded adventurous when I told people about it back home, but once you're actually out there, it's not the postcard image of Alaska most folks picture. It's raw, wet, and unforgiving country. The Delta River isn't some quiet stream. It's a fast, cold, unpredictable current that will chew you up if you don't respect it. We had 3 rafts in total, each with 2 people. My partner and I had been assigned one, and for a week we floated the river, stopping when needed, logging details, and trying to make sense of land that never really feels like it belongs to people. You're just a visitor out there, tolerated for a short time. We flew in, dropped on the river, and let the flow take us day by day. By the time we reached the second to last day, I was worn down. The constant dampness, the miles of river, the thick clouds of mosquitoes, and the fact that you never really sleep well in the field, it all piles up. My body felt like it was running on fumes. When we pulled off the river that evening to make camp, I just wanted a flat, dry spot to throw down the tent and close my eyes. But Alaska doesn't give you that luxury. You don't pick perfect places, you take what you can find. We searched along the edge, looking for ground above the waterline. The Delta River eats at its banks, and most of what we found was either soggy or too close to where the water could rise in the night. Eventually, we came across a patch of gravel and dirt just high enough to give us safety from the river. It wasn't ideal. It was right along the river's edge, a natural travel route for anything looking for food. Bears especially. I knew it as soon as we chose it. Grizzlies follow the rivers like highways, searching for fish, sniffing out carcasses, looking for anything edible. Setting camp there wasn't smart, but it was the only spot that wasn't underwater or unstable. We went through the motions of bear safety anyway, cooking and storing food away from camp, using the bear-proof containers, cleaning up everything. The logic was simple: do everything right and hope you don't get tested. The air cooled quickly as the sun slid lower, though in summer up there, it never really gets dark. It just fades to a dim glow, a gray light that sticks with you through the night. That strange half-light plays tricks on your mind. Shadows are stretched out and never quite vanish. The river kept up its constant roar, like a machine running without pause. I remember sitting for a moment, staring across the water, my legs aching, the skin of my hands cracked from the dry air, my body coated in dust and mosquito bites. I wanted to go home, but that was still days away. For now, the best thing I could do was crawl into my sleeping bag and shut out the world. Inside the tent, I let the sound of the river drown everything else. My partner was out like a rock. I tried to relax, telling myself we'd made it almost a week without any real problems. The chance of something happening now seemed slim. I drifted off, my body sagging into a deep, heavy sleep. I don't know how long I was out before it happened. At first, it was just pressure. A strange weight pushing down on my head, like the tent had collapsed or someone was leaning against it. In the haze of sleep, I didn't register it. But then I felt heat, moisture, a wetness pressing into the fabric just inches from my skull. My eyes shot open. The dim light filtered through the nylon, and I realized the tent wall was bulging inward, bending almost to the ground. Something alive was on the other side. I held my breath, trying to convince myself it was the wind. But then I heard it, breathing. Slow, heavy, deliberate breaths. And in between licking. A thick tongue dragging across the fabric, smearing wet lines. My blood went cold. It was a bear. A grizzly, and it wasn't just passing by. It was investigating me. My head, my scent, the whole tent. I could hear saliva dripping, hear the faint rumble of its throat. The tent wall bent so far and I could see the shape of its muzzle pressing against me. Its mouth was open. I could smell it, hot, musky, foul breath that filled the air. I froze completely. My body didn't even feel like mine. I was just a mind trapped in a sack of meat, waiting to be torn open. My brain spun out of control. I thought about the bear spray, outside the tent, where it might as well have been on another planet. I thought about the way grizzlies kill, how quick and brutal it is, how you don't get second chances. I thought about how stupid it was to set camp here, how obvious the mistake had been. I wanted to move, to scream, to do something, but I couldn't. My bowels felt like they were about to give out, and I honestly thought my heart would just explode from pounding so hard. I was convinced this was it. I would be ripped apart in seconds, and nobody would even hear me over the roar of the river. Then, something primal took over. Not logic, not planning, just raw instinct. The bear's nose was pressed so close I could feel its breath. Without thinking, I blew into its nostrils as hard as I could. A sharp, desperate blast of air. The reaction was instant. The bear reared back, the tent snapping upright as its weight left the fabric. I heard a loud huff, claws scuffing the ground, and then crashing movement as it retreated. For a second, I didn't believe it had worked. I lay there, crushed under the collapsed tent, too scared to even move. My ears strained for sound. The river kept roaring, but in between I caught fading footsteps, heavy and irregular, moving away through the gravel and brush. I didn't breathe. Not for a long time. Eventually I shifted, pulling the fabric off me, sitting up inside the mangled tent. My body shook so badly I thought I might vomit. My partner was still out cold, unbelievably. I wanted to shake him awake, scream at him, do something, but what was the point? The bear was gone for now. My hands searched around in the half-light until I found the bear spray. I clutched it like a lifeline, holding it close, staring at the thin nylon walls around me. I knew they meant nothing. If that bear decided to come back, I was done. The tent might as well have been paper. Sleep wasn't even a possibility after that. I sat awake the rest of the night, knees pulled up, spray in hand, eyes darting to every shadow that shifted outside. Every time the wind rustled, every snap of brush, my body locked up. I was sure it was back. The longest hours of my life stretched until the river lightened into morning. When we finally packed up, I couldn't even speak. My partner asked what was wrong, and I just shook my head. The truth felt too heavy to say out loud. I had been a hair's breadth from death, saved only by a reflex I didn't even know I had. We floated out the last stretch of river in silence, and when we finally reached Delta Junction and stepped off the raft for the last time, I remember standing there on solid ground, thinking about how close I had come to never leaving. The others joked, laughed, talked about showers and real food. I couldn't join in. My mind was stuck on the sound of that breathing, the heat of that saliva, the way the tent had bent around my head like a coffin lid. I knew then that Alaska doesn't care about you. You can follow all the rules, do everything right, and still find yourself one mistake away from being just another story told in hushed tones. I left with a new understanding. Out there, you're never in control. You're never safe. You're just tolerated, for as long as the wilderness allows it. That night on the river, I came closer to the edge than I ever wanted, and the truth is, I'll never sleep the same way again. Even now, in the comfort of my own bed, in the dark quiet of home, sometimes I wake in the night with the memory of hot breath on the other side of thin fabric, and I remember exactly how fragile life feels when the wild decides to remind you. I have only lived in Alaska for 2 years, but it feels like a lifetime of danger and stories have been packed into that short span. People told me before I came here that Alaska wasn't for the weak. They said it wasn't just the cold or the long winters, but the land itself, the animals, the isolation, and the way death sometimes seemed to sit just at the edge of everyday life. I shrugged it off back then, thinking it was just locals trying to make their state sound wilder than it really was. But in these 2 years, I have learned the truth firsthand, and I don't shrug it off anymore. The first time reality really hit me was last year, not long after summer broke and the woods opened up for training season on base. I wasn't part of the group that day, but I was close enough to hear the story hours after it happened. A handful of soldiers had gone into the dense forest to mark out a new land navigation course. They were spread out in the heavy brush, focused on their maps, compasses, and landmarks. Alaska woods are thick, the kind where visibility shrinks down to 20 or 30 feet in some places. They stumbled onto something none of them expected, a grizzly den. You'd think they would be impossible to miss, but in summer, with moss and brush covering everything, a den can look like nothing more than a hollowed-out mound of dirt and roots. The bear was home. It didn't roar a warning or give them a chance to retreat. It came out in an explosion of muscle and fur, silent at first, like a shadow breaking free from the ground. By the time it made noise, it was already on one of them. They tried to yell, to spread out, but panic and shock ruled the moment. One soldier never got back up. The bear mauled him before the others could react, and when they finally fired shots and scared it off, he was gone. It wasn't a training exercise anymore. It was death, raw and real, right there on a patch of earth that looked no different from anywhere else we had walked. That story stuck with me. I wasn't even there, but the weight of it sank deep. I imagined walking through the same kind of woods, how quiet it could be, how the air carried only the sound of wind and birds, and how close death might be without me even knowing. That's the thing about Alaska. It doesn't announce itself when it comes for you. It doesn't care if you're trained, if you're armed, if you're cautious. It just waits until you step wrong. Right before Christmas in 2023, another story rattled me even harder, because it wasn't about soldiers or training. It was just a couple, two people who loved each other, celebrating their anniversary the way many Alaskans do, by going outside, walking their dogs, enjoying the quiet frozen world together. They were on a trail near the Anchorage area, the North Forks Trail. In winter, the rivers and lakes out here freeze thick. People drive trucks out onto them, fish through holes, ski across the surfaces like it's solid ground. But nothing is perfect. Ice has weak spots, currents carve out places thinner than others, and snow can cover the signs. One of their dogs ran ahead and broke through. Anyone who has owned a dog understands. It's not just an animal, it's family. The mom went in after it without thinking twice. The ice closed around her. Her husband tried, but she never came back up. Weeks later, they found her under that ice, arms locked around the dog she refused to let go of. When I read that story, I stared at the wall for a long time. I could picture the silence of that trail, the crisp air, the sound of boots crunching snow, and then the scream of cracking ice followed by water swallowing everything. I could feel the instant regret, the helplessness, and finally, the cold that doesn't forgive. Almost 2 years ago, long before I even arrived here, another story still circles around conversations. A father and his young son went hunting. Normal enough here, hunting is life for many families. They were out in the woods, rifles ready, scanning for moose or caribou. Out of nowhere, a bear came for the boy. In the blur of seconds, it could have been the end. But the father didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle and fired, taking the bear down before it could finish what it started. His son lived, but I can't help but think of how close that edge is. How easily it could have gone the other way. Out here, the line between life and death is so thin, so fragile. A single heartbeat can decide everything. And then there's Anchorage itself. For all the wildness, the woods, the animals, the ice and mountains, the scariest thing sometimes is just the people. Anchorage isn't some untouched wilderness town with nothing but moose walking the streets. It's a city, and it has its shadows. I read that there are almost as many convicted sex offenders here as in Washington, D.C. That wouldn't mean as much if Anchorage were the same size as D.C., but it's not. D.C. has 3 times the population. That means Anchorage has an unsettling ratio, like danger is packed in tighter, closer. You walk down certain streets at night, and you feel eyes on you, not from animals in the brush, but from people, strangers who see opportunity in the isolation of others. Living here, you learn to always pay attention. You don't just hike without knowing where you are. You don't just walk on ice without reading the conditions. You don't ignore the way the woods go silent, or how the wind shifts, or how footsteps might follow. Alaska doesn't forgive mistakes. That's the clearest truth I've learned in these 2 years. I think about that soldier who never came home, about the mother who died with her dog in her arms, about the father who nearly lost his son to the wild, and about the unsettling number of dangerous people that walk the same streets I do. These aren't campfire stories meant to spook people. They're real. They're pieces of life here, carved into the land and whispered through the cold. When you live in Alaska, you don't just fight the weather or the wilderness. You fight the statistics, the odds, the simple truth that this place eats people alive when they're not careful, or even when they are. Every time I lace up my boots, every time I drive outside the city, every time I step onto a frozen surface or hear branches crack behind me in the woods, I think of those stories. They don't leave me. They remind me that survival here isn't guaranteed. You respect the land, or it will take something from you. You pay attention, or it will punish you. Alaska is beautiful, maybe the most beautiful place I've ever seen, but beauty doesn't mean safety. It's sharp-edged beauty, the kind that can kill you while you're admiring it. That's what 2 years here has taught me. I came thinking I'd just live my life like anywhere else. Instead, I've learned to keep my head on a swivel, to never get too comfortable, to know that even joy comes with risk. And in Alaska, the stories aren't legends or myths. They're the news, they're the warnings, they're the things you see happen to people just like you. I don't tell myself it won't happen to me. I just tell myself I'll do everything I can to keep it from happening today. Because here, that's the only promise you can make. And when I think of leaving, of going somewhere else, I wonder if I'd ever really feel safe again, or if Alaska has burned it into me too deep, that quiet voice always reminding me that danger is never as far away as we want to believe. I had been hunting for most of my life by then. In Alaska, you learn to be comfortable in the woods, or you didn't last long out there. The land is big, wild, and indifferent to whether you make it home at the end of the day. I wasn't the kind of man who scared easy, but I had a healthy respect for what lived out there. Moose, caribou, wolves, and especially bears. My father drilled it into me when I was a boy. You give the bears their space, and you never let your guard down when you know they're around. That morning had started like any other hunting trip. My buddy and I had driven out in his truck before the sun rose, bouncing along the dirt road until the trees closed in thick around us. We parked near an old game trail, shouldered our rifles, and started off into the woods. The air was cold enough to sting your nose, and the dew clung to everything. The sound of our boots crunching the trail was the only noise until the birds began to stir. We were after moose. The meat would last the winter, and the hunt itself was something I looked forward to every year. We decided, as we often did, to split up once we got far enough into the woods. Covering more ground made sense, and I wasn't worried. I had been out there more times than I could count, and though there was always a risk in being alone, that was part of the deal when you hunted Alaska. After 20 minutes of walking alone, I came to a small clearing. The trees thinned, letting in a wash of pale light. That's when I froze. Standing right in the middle of the clearing was a brown bear sow, 2 cubs scrambling behind her into the brush. Time slowed. She turned her head toward me, and for a second her small eyes locked on mine. I knew exactly what I had walked into, and my stomach dropped. A mother with cubs is the worst situation you can find yourself in. There's no talking your way out, no bluffing her off. She sees you as a threat to her babies, and she'll come until you're gone, or dead. I didn't think. Instinct took over. I bolted for the nearest tree and scrambled up, grabbing branches, tearing my hands on bark, pulling myself higher as fast as I could. Behind me, I heard her crashing through the brush, a roar tearing through the clearing. She was on me before I even found my footing on the branches, swiping at my boots, snapping her jaws so close I felt the air move. My heart hammered in my throat. I kept climbing, branches scraping my face, until I was far enough that her paws couldn't quite reach me. She circled the tree, grumbling low in her chest, glaring up at me. Her teeth flashed as she snapped at the bark, and she reared up on her hind legs, clawing gouges into the trunk. The tree shook under her weight. I held on tight, praying the branches wouldn't give way. After a few terrifying minutes, she dropped back down, paced a few times, and then disappeared into the thick brush. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise. I stayed up there, clinging to the tree, every muscle tight. My lungs burned from running and climbing, but I didn't move. I told myself I'd wait until I was sure she was gone. A few minutes passed, and all I could hear was the forest slowly coming back to life around me. The wind in the leaves, a raven calling somewhere distant. Finally, when I thought I had waited long enough, I began to climb back down. My boots hit the ground, and I stood still, listening hard, eyes darting to every shadow in the brush. Nothing. I took a deep breath and started walking, slow at first, back toward the trail. That's when I heard it, the heavy crashing of something big moving fast through the brush, followed by a deep, guttural roar that made every hair on my body stand up. She hadn't left. She had been waiting. My stomach turned cold. I spun and sprinted to another tree, adrenaline giving me speed I didn't know I had. I scrambled up, just barely hauling myself out of her reach as she slammed into the trunk. The whole tree shuddered as she clawed at it, roaring, snapping at my boots. I pulled my legs up, pressing myself flat against the branches, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. She circled again, snarling, swiping, pacing around and around. Her frustration was clear in the guttural sounds she made. Then, just like before, she turned and crashed back into the brush, vanishing as quickly as she had come. I stayed frozen in the branches, breathing hard, sweat pouring down my back despite the cold. Minutes dragged by. The forest seemed too quiet again, and I didn't trust it. I told myself I wouldn't make the same mistake twice. I wasn't going to climb down after a few minutes. I waited. 10 minutes. 15. 20. Every second stretched out. My legs cramped, my hands ached from gripping the bark, but I didn't move. I kept my eyes scanning the ground, looking for the slightest twitch of movement. Half an hour passed before I finally dared to move. Slowly, carefully, I climbed down, pausing on each branch to listen. My boots touched the ground, and I crouched low, scanning the tree line. Nothing stirred. The silence was still unnerving, but I couldn't stay there forever. I had to get back to the trail. I eased forward, moving slow, every step deliberate, every sense on high alert. I thought maybe, just maybe, I had finally lost her. Then the brush exploded to my left. She barreled out, faster than I could have imagined something so massive could move. I bolted, lungs heaving, legs pumping, every instinct screaming at me to get off the ground. Another tree loomed ahead, and I jumped for it, clawing my way up just as she snapped at my heels again. Her teeth clacked shut on empty air. I pulled myself higher, heart hammering, vision narrowing to nothing but survival. She raged at the base of that tree longer this time, snarling, swiping, throwing her weight against the trunk hard enough to rattle my teeth. The bark splintered under her claws, strips peeling away as she tried to get at me. I clung to the branches, praying the tree was strong enough to withstand her fury. At last, she huffed, paced in circles, and then melted back into the brush again. I didn't move. I couldn't risk it. I waited longer this time, 30 minutes at least, maybe more. My body screamed in pain from holding still, but I stayed watching, listening. Finally, when the woods seemed calm again, I started down. Every step was agony, my nerves stretched so thin they felt like wires ready to snap. I paused at the base, scanning again, forcing myself to breathe slow. Nothing. I moved, careful, deliberate, until I found the game trail again. My only thought was to get back to the truck. My buddy was waiting, and I needed out of those woods before the bear got her chance at me. My boots hit the dirt of the trail, and I forced myself into a steady pace, not running, not yet, just moving as quietly and quickly as I could. My ears strained at every sound, every crunch of leaves, every creak of branches overhead. Somehow, finally, the trees thinned, and I caught sight of the truck through the gaps. Relief hit me so hard I almost stumbled. I hurried the last stretch, every step carrying the weight of what had just happened. When I reached the truck and leaned against it, it was like the air finally came back into my lungs. My buddy stood there, rifle slung over his shoulder, looking at me like I'd been gone for hours. I didn't tell him the whole story then. I didn't have the words yet. All I could manage was the truth in the simplest form, Mama Bear. Even now, years later, I can still hear her roar when I close my eyes. I can feel the way the tree shook under her weight, the sting of bark tearing my hands, the sickening dread of realizing she was waiting for me each time I thought I was free. The woods teach you lessons, and that day I learned one I never forgot. You can think you know the land, you can think you've got control, but out there, you're never more than a heartbeat away from being reminded that you're just another animal trying to survive. And I survived, but only barely. I used to work at a Fred Meyer in Fairbanks, Alaska. It was one of those jobs where the days blend together. The fluorescent lights make every shift feel the same, and the seasons outside remind you just how harsh Alaska really is. In the winter, you go into work in the dark and leave in the dark. In the summer, the sun never seems to go down, and people wander into the store at 2 in the morning like it's noon. The job itself wasn't glamorous, but it gave me plenty of stories, most of which faded into the background after a while. But there's one story that has stayed with me, and it's one of those that I'll never shake, no matter how much time passes. It's the kind of thing you can't unsee, and you can't unknow once it all plays out. There was this family that came in fairly often. A man, a woman, and a little boy. Later on, the woman was pregnant, and then she had a baby, so the family grew during the time I saw them. Nothing about them seemed particularly remarkable at first. Families came into Fred Meyer all the time. You get used to recognizing regulars, you start noticing patterns in how they shop, how they behave. But this family stuck out because every time they came in, there was this energy about them. The man especially. He carried himself in a way that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, even when I couldn't pinpoint why. I've always believed in gut instincts, and something about him set mine off from the beginning. One day, they came in, and I noticed right away that the man seemed off. More off than usual. He was moving slow, like his body wasn't working the way it should. His eyes didn't look right either. They were glassy, unfocused, like he was drifting through the store in a haze. When he got close enough, I noticed he had a hospital bracelet on his wrist. That in itself was unusual, but people do come into stores after hospital visits. What hit me harder was when he leaned close to talk to me, his words slurred and strange, and he said he had just had surgery. He didn't look like someone who should even be out of bed, let alone wandering around a busy store. And then my eyes caught something else, a gun on his hip. Now, this is Alaska. Guns are part of daily life for a lot of people. You see them in trucks, you see them strapped to hips, it isn't rare. But this situation was different. He was clearly not sober, clearly unwell, maybe still on medication, maybe something else. Whatever it was, he wasn't in his right state of mind, and that gun suddenly became the only thing I could focus on. It felt wrong, dangerously wrong, like a puzzle piece that didn't fit but was forced into place anyway. My stomach knotted. Every instinct I had screamed at me that this man should not have that gun. Not today. Maybe not ever. I tried to keep my composure and went to my supervisor. I told her that he was loopy, not sober, fresh out of the hospital, and carrying a gun. She looked at me like I was overreacting. She said, "What can I do about it?" That was it. No follow-up, no concern. Just a shrug like this was another day in Alaska. I remember standing there, frustrated and unsettled, wishing she had taken me seriously. I felt helpless. What could I do? He wasn't breaking any laws in that moment. He hadn't threatened anyone. But I knew what I was seeing wasn't right. As I kept watching him, things got stranger. He had picked up a package of chicken from the meat department, but instead of keeping it sealed like anyone else would, he opened it up and started shoving the raw chicken into a plastic bag right there in front of the customer service desk. He poured something else in with it, like he was marinating it on the spot, standing in the middle of the store. People nearby gave him side eyes, but nobody said anything. He even tried to return the chicken that didn't fit in the bag, like the store was supposed to take back raw meat he had tampered with. It was disgusting, unsettling, and bizarre. He ended up waiting in line for customer service, but he was impatient and angry, muttering to himself, his face twisting with frustration. Eventually, he went and dragged a chair from the home department across the store, so he could sit while waiting. The sound of that chair scraping against the floor seemed to echo longer than it should have. The whole time, he was snapping at the woman. She looked tired, worn down, like she had been dealing with this kind of thing for a long time. The little boy ran around eating cherries from the produce section without paying for them, spitting pits out onto the floor as he went. It was chaos, pure and simple, but it wasn't the normal kind of family chaos you sometimes see in stores. This felt darker. It was one of those moments where you know you're witnessing something that isn't right, but you don't know what to do about it. So you just watch, uneasy, waiting for it to end. Eventually they left. But that experience stuck in my mind. The way he moved, the way he carried himself, the gun on his hip, the way he treated the woman. It all stayed with me like a shadow I couldn't shake. I went home that night thinking about it, replaying the details in my head. I told myself I was probably just overthinking it, that it was just one bad shopping trip. But deep down, I knew better. Deep down, I knew something was wrong. Weeks passed and life moved on. Work was the same grind of stocking, assisting customers, watching people rush through their days. The memory of that family would resurface now and then, but it started to fade into the background noise of all the other things I saw working there. Until one morning, when I was scrolling through the news, and their faces appeared on the screen. The headline hit me like a punch to the stomach. The man had killed the woman. He had killed their baby. He had killed his own mother. And then he had turned the gun on himself. It was all over the news. People were talking about it everywhere. A family gone, wiped out in a burst of violence. And I sat there staring at the article, my chest tight, my stomach turning, my mind going back to that day in the store. I had seen it. I had felt it. I had known something wasn't right. And now here it was, the worst possible ending. The thing I had feared, though I never could have pictured it this way, had come true. I couldn't stop thinking about the woman. The way she looked that day in the store, tired, beaten down, resigned. I thought about the boy, running around carefree, spitting cherry pits on the floor, unaware of the darkness simmering around him. I thought about the baby, so new to the world, never even given a chance to live. And I thought about the man, sitting there with a hospital bracelet on his wrist, a gun on his hip, anger in his voice, and chaos in his wake. I had stood just feet away from him. I had watched it all unfold. And now, everyone was dead. For a long time, I blamed myself. I told myself I should have done more, should have pushed harder, should have called someone, anyone. I replayed the conversation with my supervisor in my head over and over. "What can I do about it?" she had said. Maybe nothing, but wasn't that the problem? We all saw something wrong and just shrugged because it didn't cross a legal line in that moment. But laws don't measure danger the way instincts do. I knew and I did nothing, and now people were gone. I carried that weight for months. It sank into me, gnawed at me, made me question everything. How many times do we see signs and ignore them? How many times do we brush things off because they aren't our problem? How many people out there are walking time bombs, ready to explode, and we just walk past them in grocery store aisles? Even now, years later, I can still see him standing there in front of the customer service desk, stuffing chicken into a bag, muttering under his breath, the gun heavy on his hip. I can still see the woman's tired eyes, the boy's careless grin, the way the store felt heavier with them inside. I can still feel that knot in my stomach, the way every instinct told me something terrible was on the horizon. And I was right. I was so right it still makes me sick. The truth is, that family never really left the store. Not for me. They haunt those aisles in my memory. Every time I think back to working at Fred Meyer, they're there. The day I realized just how thin the line is between an ordinary customer experience and something that will end up on the news. The day I realized how powerless we really are when instincts scream, but rules say to stand still. And the day I learned that sometimes, the scariest things you'll ever see aren't ghosts or monsters or shadows in the woods. Sometimes, it's a man in a grocery store with a hospital bracelet on his wrist, a gun on his hip, and a darkness inside him that no one will stop until it's too late. I had been in Alaska long enough to understand that the land had its own rules, rules that didn't bend for anyone, no matter how experienced they thought they were. The wilderness out there is a living thing, cold, harsh, unforgiving, and it never forgets. People vanish all the time, swallowed whole by its sheer size and indifference. I'd heard stories, of course, hunters who walked off trail and never came back, bush pilots whose planes went down without a trace, hikers who simply disappeared into the endless forests. But stories stay stories until you're standing there with the truth beneath your boots. It was early September, the start of caribou season, when my buddy decided to head 10 miles off the Taylor Highway, south of the little speck of a town called Chicken. I wasn't with him that first day. He had gone out with a couple of other guys we knew, covering ground in search of migration paths. The air had been clear, cool, with that early bite of winter whispering from the north. The tundra rolled out in shades of brown and fading green, willows bending low, dry streambeds cut like scars through the landscape. That's where it started. They were crossing one of those wide, gravel-bottomed beds, empty and silent, when something caught their eyes. At first it looked like nothing, just a bit of rusted metal poking out of the rock. But the more they looked, the clearer it became. A gun barrel. The last few inches of a rifle sticking straight up from the gravel, as if the earth itself had swallowed it. They dug it out, hands raw from the cold stones, brushing dirt and grit off the weathered steel. It was no lost or dropped hunting rifle. It had been buried by time, left there for years. When they came back to camp that evening and showed me, the weight of it hit me harder than the chill of the wind. Something about that gun didn't sit right. It wasn't just a lost tool. In Alaska, nothing stays half-hidden like that without a story behind it. They took it into talk the next morning, straight to the troopers' detachment. A few days later, word came back. The serial number belonged to one of 4 hunters who had gone missing more than a decade earlier. I remembered the case faintly. News had spread fast back then. 4 men, experienced outdoorsmen, all vanished without a trace somewhere between Chicken and Talk. Search parties had gone out, helicopters combed the valleys, but nothing had ever turned up. Over the years, most people had written them off as another mystery swallowed by the interior. Maybe they got lost, maybe a bear tore through their camp, maybe they just made a mistake and never recovered. Alaska has a way of keeping its secrets. But this time, the secret was about to be pulled out into the open. When the troopers organized a recovery, they asked us to lead them back to where the rifle had been found. The drive out from Talk was long, the road chewing up time in slow miles, mountains rising all around us. That stretch of country feels like the edge of the earth. No towns, no signs of people, just miles of spruce and willow, dry riverbeds, and hills rolling like waves frozen in place. We parked off the Taylor Highway, tightened our boots, and followed the same path into the backcountry. It didn't take long before the officers spread out, their orange vests catching the pale light as they worked across the land in a slow line. Fish and game officers, troopers, all walking with practiced patience. And then one of them stopped, crouched down, and waved the others over. We made our way there, and what I saw rooted me in place. It was a torn scrap of fabric, wedged into the stones. Faded, weather-beaten, but unmistakably part of a tent. A few yards farther, something else, nylon shredded by teeth and time, the remains of a sleeping bag scattered across the gravel. We fanned out more, and the ground began to give up its story. Bits of equipment, rusted cookware, broken plastic, fragments of gear that once belonged to 4 men who never came home. And then the worst of it, bones. They weren't whole, not anymore. Time and animals had done their work. A femur lying alone in the gravel, a ribcage gnawed and cracked, fragments of a skull half buried in silt. Some of the remains had been scattered far, dragged by animals, wolves, foxes, even bears. The wilderness doesn't waste. Seeing it spread out like that was sickening, but more than that, it was humbling. Death out here isn't neat. It isn't clean. It tears people down the same way it tears down fallen trees, slowly and without care, until there's almost nothing left to tell the story. But the troopers pieced it together. You could see the line of the dry stream bed, the way it curved down from the higher country. The tents had been pitched right there in the low ground. It must have seemed safe enough on a dry night, a wide bed of gravel with no water in sight. But 60 miles away, somewhere deep in the mountains, a storm had unleashed itself. Up there, the rain fell heavy, filling the veins of the land until the water rushed downhill, unseen and unheard in the dark. By the time it reached the hunters' camp, it would have been a wall of water ripping through the stream bed. The evidence was clear in the way the remains were scattered. The men had been in their sleeping bags, zipped in tight against the cold when it hit. The flood came roaring down the channel, lifting everything in its path. Tents collapsed, men trapped inside, dragged under by their own gear. Imagine the panic, pitch black, the roar of water, bodies twisted in nylon and canvas, fighting to breathe. Some must have drowned within minutes, their lungs filling as they were rolled and beaten against the rocks. Others may have struggled longer, battered and disoriented, their cries swallowed by the flood. By the time the water passed, what was left was destruction, silence, and the slow work of nature reclaiming them. I stood there looking at the bones, the gear, the rifle that had started it all. A decade ago, men had bedded down for the night thinking it was just another hunt, just another evening in the wild. They probably sat around a small fire, maybe shared a laugh, maybe talked about the next day's trail. They had no idea that 60 miles away, in some unseen mountain basin, the storm was already building their grave. It haunted me. The idea that you can do everything right, set up camp, stay together, carry the right gear, and still have the land decide otherwise. You can be the strongest, the smartest, the most experienced, but out here, that means nothing when the weather turns against you. There's no warning, no mercy, just a sudden shift that ends everything. The troopers gathered the remains carefully, each piece marked and collected. Silence hung over all of us, the kind of silence that sits heavy in the chest. Nobody needed to say anything. The story was written across the ground. When they left, the place was quiet again, as though nothing had ever happened. The stream bed lay dry and harmless, the sky wide and empty, but I couldn't look at it without seeing the water tearing through, hearing the shouts lost in the dark. That night, back in camp, I lay awake in my sleeping bag, listening to the faint rush of the distant river. I kept thinking about how fragile it all is, how a thin layer of nylon and a bed of gravel can feel like safety, until the land reminds you otherwise. I thought about those men, how their families must have waited, how the mystery had stretched for 10 years until a rusted rifle broke the silence. At least now there was an answer, as terrible as it was. When I finally slept, my dreams were full of water. A black wave rising out of the night, sweeping everything away, leaving nothing but bones and scraps in its wake. And even now, years later, I can't step into a dry stream bed without feeling that same chill down my spine. Out here, the land keeps score, and sometimes it takes a decade before you learn the truth. That was the ending for them, quiet, cruel, and absolute. And for me, it was a reminder burned into my memory that Alaska doesn't give second chances. It takes what it wants, when it wants, and the best you can do is hope you're not in its path when it decides. I can still feel that kind of cold in my bones when I think back to it. The kind of cold that doesn't just sting your skin but sinks deeper, like it's pressing on your lungs and slowing your blood down. Alaska in winter has a way of showing you just how small you really are and how quickly things can go wrong. That night I learned it the hard way, standing outside Chena Hot Springs with a duffel bag in my hand, my breath freezing in the air, and the sound of the door slamming shut behind me because I had mouthed off to Big Red, the chef. I had been stupid. My temper always seemed to get the better of me, and in that kitchen it only took a spark. He was already on edge, running things like he owned the whole place, and I let words fly that I shouldn't have. Next thing I knew, I was out, told to clear out by midnight. I remember looking at my watch and realizing midnight wasn't far off. It was minus 45 degrees, the kind of cold that makes your eyelashes freeze together. My girlfriend was waiting in the van, sick, curled up under a blanket in the passenger seat. She had been fighting stomach pains for days, and I already suspected something was wrong with her gallbladder. I hadn't even told her yet that I'd been fired. The van sat there in the lot with the gas gauge barely above empty. I'd been pushing it as far as I could, stretching every last drop because money was thin. The engine made a tired groan when I started it, like it didn't want to wake up either, and the air that came through the vents was colder than outside. I climbed in, rubbing my hands together, trying not to show how worried I was. Fairbanks was about 60 miles away, and with the way that gauge was leaning, it felt like a gamble we might not win. The drive that night felt endless. The road cut through darkness, nothing but snow and black woods on either side. My headlights barely lit more than a few yards ahead. Every mile marker looked the same, just a post half buried in snow with frost shining off it. I kept glancing at the gauge, at my girlfriend's pale face in the dim light, at the road stretching out like it would never end. I tried to push the van steady, not too fast, not too slow, hoping to squeeze every bit out of the tank. There were moments I swore the engine would sputter and quit, and my mind kept running through what would happen if it did. At 40 below, walking wasn't an option. We wouldn't last an hour out there, not dressed the way we were. I imagined the silence of the woods swallowing us up, the frost creeping over us as we sat there in a dead van. That thought made me press the gas a little harder, even though it wasn't smart. Somehow, against all odds, the lights of Fairbanks finally showed up through the black. It was like seeing a miracle, a scatter of yellow against the frozen horizon. The van rolled into town like it was running on fumes alone, every turn of the wheels feeling borrowed. I don't even remember stopping at lights, just heading straight to the hospital. Inside the hospital, it was all fluorescent light and the sound of boots squeaking on tile. I got her checked in, watched them while her back, and then I was left standing in the waiting room with the weight of it all pressing down. I was exhausted, strung out from the cold and the drive, but there was no bed waiting for me. The van was all I had, and that's where I went when they finally told me she'd be kept for observation. That van became my shelter, if you can call it that. I parked in the Sam's Club lot, because it was big and empty, and no one really bothered you there. The first night, I curled up in the driver's seat with every piece of clothing I had layered on me. The windows fogged up and then froze over on the inside, leaving thin lace-like patterns across the glass. Every time I breathed, the air turned to frost on my scarf. I couldn't really sleep, just drifted in and out, waking up stiff and shivering when the cold pressed too hard. By the second day, it was worse. The sun was out, but it didn't mean warmth. I tried to start the van every so often just to run the heat for a while, but I couldn't waste gas. I walked into the Sam's Club during the day, wandering the aisles just to be in heat, pretending to shop so I wouldn't be asked to leave. I'd linger by the racks of food, looking at things I couldn't afford, letting my hands thaw enough to feel them again. That second night, her birthday came. She was in the hospital, sick and hooked up to IVs, and I was in that frozen van trying to make sense of it all. I had nothing to give her. No gift, no cake, not even a warm place for us to sit together. Just this broken situation, just me failing to keep us afloat. I thought about walking over to the hospital and staying by her bed, but visiting hours had ended, and I knew they wouldn't let me in. So I sat there in the van, watching my breath curl in the dark, feeling the weight of how far things had slipped. On her birthday, I also stopped at the post office just to check our box. I don't know why I thought it would be anything good. Maybe a card from family, maybe some small thing that would make the day feel less heavy. Instead, what I found was a letter with her name on it, a legal envelope that carried more weight than I could imagine. Divorce papers. She had left her husband before coming here, trying to start over, and we had been living in the shadow of that ever since. Seeing those papers in my hand felt like a door slamming shut that I had no control over. It wasn't just her birthday anymore. It was the day she was officially being told it was over. I sat in the van with that envelope, the world outside colder than ever, and wondered how much more either of us could take. The third night in that parking lot felt like the longest of my life. I kept waking up thinking about how quickly things had fallen apart. 1 week earlier, I had a job and a roof over my head, and now I was shivering in a van with no plan. I thought about leaving Alaska altogether, but I didn't even have the money for gas to get out of Fairbanks, let alone cross states. The cold pressed in from every direction, and I knew if I slipped up even once, fell asleep too long with the van off, I might not wake up again. By the morning after, when the frost on the inside of the windows was thick enough to scrape with my fingernails, I realized I had to make a choice. I couldn't keep doing it like this, waiting for something to change while freezing in a parking lot. I had to swallow my pride, reach out, ask for help from anyone I could, even if it meant admitting how badly I had failed. That's what Alaska does to you. It strips you down to nothing, makes you face the raw edge of survival. Out there, at 40 below, pride doesn't keep you warm, and stubbornness doesn't fill your gas tank. What keeps you alive is knowing when you're beaten, and finding a way forward anyway. I don't remember much about leaving that parking lot except the way the van coughed when I turned the key, and the way my fingers ached as I gripped the wheel. I remember driving slow through Fairbanks, the whole town wrapped in ice, and thinking about how I had burned so many bridges. I thought about Big Red back at Chena, still barking orders in his kitchen, while I was out here scraping frost off the inside of a windshield. It wasn't ghosts or monsters that made that week in Alaska terrifying. It was the reality of it, the way the cold can squeeze the life out of you, the way bad luck piles up, the way you can feel so utterly small and powerless. Looking back, it wasn't one moment that stuck with me most, but the string of them together. The firing, the endless drive on fumes, the hospital, the parking lot, her birthday with nothing but pain and papers. What I learned in those nights is that survival doesn't always look like triumph. Sometimes it's just gritting your teeth through the longest night of your life and making it to morning. Sometimes it's admitting you've lost more than you thought you could, and still starting the engine one more time. And sometimes survival is just sitting in a frozen van, waiting for the sun to rise, and realizing that as long as it does, you still have a chance to keep going. That was the clear truth of it all. Alaska didn't care about me, didn't care about my pride or my mistakes. It could have taken me if it wanted to, but I made it through just barely, and that was enough.